Hi, welcome back to your lecture videos. Today we're going to be talking about audience. Who is your audience? And who are you writing to? And more importantly, how are you writing to make it specific to them? How are you going to make sure that your words really resonate with your reader? Audience is whoever is reading your writing. In class, this literally means your instructor and classmates. But in real life, you won't always personally know who your audience is. You don't always know who is reading your writing, so we shouldn't always assume that you're writing to your instructor or classmates. Therefore, we need to get a better idea of who your audience is and how you can tailor your writing to that reader. To start examining audience, let's look at some examples of how audience affects movies and how movies have changed to meet the demands of their audiences. Our first example is My Best Friend's Wedding. In this movie, Julia Roberts is in love with her best friend, but she doesn't realize it until he's about to marry someone else. Then we meet her other best friend, not the groom, played by Rupert Everett, who happens to be gay, so that eliminates any possible love triangles. When this movie was originally made, Rupert Everett had a very small role as Julia Roberts' gay best friend. But when the film was viewed by test audiences before it was released, the audiences liked Rupert Everett's character so much that they wanted to see more of him. So now let's flash forward to the final scene of the movie. The man has married the other woman, and Julia Roberts is sad and sitting by herself at the reception. She's talking on the phone with Rupert Everett, who, as it turns out, has hung around and comes back to dance with her at the wedding. But this scene never originally existed. It was only added to the film to please the audience. The next example of how audience can affect movies is Fatal Attraction. Married man Michael Douglas has a steamy affair with co-worker Glenn Close. Glenn Close's character dies at the end of this movie, but that isn't how the script was originally written. The test audiences hated her character so much that the entire ending was rewritten to kill her off. I guess I can see why the audiences hated her. She did kill the family's pet rabbit. So she dies at the end of the movie just to please the audience. If audience is so important, how can we make sure that we're writing to the audience? And how do we know who the audience is? Well, I have a few more examples that show how sometimes things are changed to meet specific audiences. Let's look at Hansel and Gretel, the fairy tale that's been turned into multiple movies. This version looks like your typical kids movie, a fairy tale with young kids and some not so scary looking monsters. And now we have Hansel and Gretel, Witch Hunters, where Hansel and Gretel are all grown up, the monsters are a lot scarier, and suddenly they're not innocent little kids anymore. Now they're weapon-wielding witch slayers. How did we go from innocent little kids to a couple of tough fighters? The answer is simple: audience. This version of Hansel and Gretel was made for kids, so it couldn't be too scary. It had to be a little bit fantastical so kids would like it and parents would let their kids watch it. In contrast, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters was made for adults, and not just any adults, but adults who like horror movies, who like to see the bad guys beat up, and probably adults who like to see girls in tight leather clothing. The next example of how audience affects the way a story or movie takes shape is Abraham Lincoln. Here we have the movie Lincoln, a biographical war film, which I'm comparing to Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Hunter, a fictional horror movie in which Abraham Lincoln isn't a war hero, but now he is a vampire slayer. Here we have two versions of Abraham Lincoln, the war hero and 16th President of the United States, and a vampire slayer. So how are these so different? Of course, the answer is audience. This Lincoln film was made for history buffs, people who like war movies and historical biographies. Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter was made for horror movie fans who like to see vampires get their heads chopped off and who think it's funny to turn one of our presidents into a monster killer. Now let's summarize what we just learned. Audience affects the shape of a story. As we saw in our movie examples, audience can affect endings or the entire genre. Since we're not writing stories or film scripts in this class, what do you need to know about audience? That it affects what you say and how you say it. Well, what does that mean? That means that you need to keep your audience in mind when you're writing. Your wording and language changes when you're writing to different audiences. So one thing you need to consider is vocabulary. The vocabulary you use in a written work will depend on who your audience is. If you are writing to an audience made up of experts on your topic, you might use jargon or technical vocabulary specific to experts in a certain field. But if your audience is made up of people who don't know a lot about your topic, then you need to use layman's terms or everyday language everyone can understand. Why is this important? Because we don't want our readers to be scratching their heads and thinking, I don't get it. Instead, we want our readers to understand everything we are saying in our writing. So that means that one of the things we need to do when writing is change our vocabulary to match our audience. For example, if I'm a nurse and I'm writing an article to be published in a medical magazine that is read by nurses and other medical professionals, then I can use all the medical jargon I want because I know my audience will understand it. But if I'm a nurse and I'm writing a textbook to teach students about nursing, now I need to change my vocabulary to make sure that I'm explaining all those technical terms in layman's terms so that the students can understand it. In addition to vocabulary, we also have to consider our tone when we write. Tone is our attitude in writing. Our tone changes with our audience. Imagine that you're talking about a horrible day you've had and now you're stuck in traffic and you're late for class. If you call your friend while you're in the car to complain, you'll probably be a little bit whiny, and that's okay. If you're really upset and you're having some road rage and yelling at the person in front of you, you have a different tone. Now you're angry, you're yelling, and you might even be cussing, and that's okay too. But when you walk into class late and your instructor asks why, you're not going to be whiny, you're not going to yell, and you're not going to cuss. Now your tone will be respectful and apologetic. So this is all just one example of how tone changes based on your audience. Remember, you need to consider who you are writing to so your point gets across to your audience. And this means you need to change your vocabulary and your tone.